Everyone loves an underdog story when the people, the normal guys, you and me, rise up and take control from the despots, the gluttonous, oppressive overlords who've abused their power for far too long. It makes for a great story because it's something for people to rally behind. Justice, liberty, long overdue and finally won against all odds. This is why Americans are so passionate about the 4th of July. Because we freaking did it, right? Things were unfair, and we put our foot down, and although the odds were incredibly stacked against us, we gave it everything we had, and we won our freedom, right? Revolution, a fresh start. A chance for the everyman to claim his rightful place in society at last. But what if that fresh start isn't at all what people had in mind? What if it's actually way worse somehow than things were before? Unlike the American Revolution, the French Revolution, which broke out roughly 6 years later, was complicated. Ultimately, it led to a better France with fairer laws, better representation in government, and just a more unified country, ultimately. But at first, it was an absolute disaster, with many, many lessons to teach us. Lessons that apply today more than I wish they did. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. The French Revolution, a veritable Pandora's box for history lovers. I could create an entire podcast series about the French Revolution. There's so much meat to this thing. But I'm going to pack it into just 2 episodes, a tweaker. That's what, when I went to summer camp back when I was like 11, 12, I just went for 1 week each summer, but there were kids there for 2 weeks. God bless them. And they were called tweakers. So that's just ingrained in my memory forever. So this is a tweaker, kind of a tweaker and a half, actually, because there will be an associated minifix. More on that later. There are people who are like really obsessed with the French Revolution. And honestly, I've always found it pretty boring, to be honest. Like, start researching it, you guys. It's really boring. Lots of politics and economy stuff, lots of names you can't pronounce, lots and lots of boring stuff to weed through to actually get to the story. And I'm like super short on time right now. I'm trying to finish up this huge project for my real job, and I somehow got roped into hosting Thanksgiving at my house this year, which I've never done before. And literally the morning before I started researching this episode, I was making breakfast for my kids, thinking, okay, I gotta pick a really easy topic this week, short and sweet, easy to research, because I have like no time. And I'm thinking this as I'm buttering a piece of brioche toast. And then I'm thinking about brioche and how let them eat cake was actually let them eat brioche, and how Marie Antoinette never even said that, and it's all just an urban legend, and how unfair that is to her because it was very damning, although completely false. And then I'm going down a rabbit hole of fake news, media-fueled revolutions in the recent election and the French Revolution and the food prices and inflation. And by the time I'd finished buttering the toast, I had made up my mind. I was doing the French Revolution, the literal hardest, most time-consuming topic I could have possibly picked for this week. Oh, and next week too, and a mini fix to top it off. So you're welcome. I'll sacrifice myself for the cause, but I won't make it boring. I promise. Only the good stuff. So what was France like in the late 1700s? Well, it was an absolute monarchy, ruled completely by a king. This is the type of monarchy where the monarch, the king or queen, has all the power. They can do whatever they want. I mean, they're supposed to listen to people. They have like advisors and committees and stuff. But at the end of the day, they can do whatever they want. There's no constitution, no legislators, no parliament making the decisions, no checks and balances whatsoever. Just the king. So this is different from a constitutional monarchy, which is what the UK is now, right? They have a king, but he doesn't make all the decisions. He's more symbolic. Parliament makes the decisions. France was an absolute monarchy at the time, and it was ruled by King Louis XVI. Louis was born in 1754 in the Palace of Versailles into a very royal family, the Bourbons. And yes, the whiskey is named for them, sort of, indirectly. I mean, it was named after places that were named after them. Louis was the grandson of the current king, Louis XV. He was also the great-great-great-grandson of Louis XIV, who was known as the Sun King. This is the guy who built Versailles. And you might be like, now wait a minute, that's a lot of greats to jump from only the 14th to the 16th. Well, that's because Louis XIV ruled France for a whopping 72 years and 100 days, the longest reigning monarch in the history of all of Europe and possibly the world. He ruled for so long that by the time he died in 1715 at the age of 76, yes, he became king when he was 4, only his great-grandson was left to take the throne. Louis XV, who was also 4 at the time. And then Louis XV ruled for almost 60 years, so that when he died, only his grandson was left to take the throne. And yes, that's our guy, Louis XVI. So between just those two guys, Louis XIV and Louis XV, we're talking about 130-some-year reign of absolute monarchy. Just those two guys controlled France for 130 years, starting when they were toddlers. I mean, they had regents that helped them rule until they were old enough, but still, how absolutely insane is that? Have you ever met a 4-year-old? How are you going to make a 4-year-old the ruler of an entire country? It's bananas. So Louis XVI is born in the royalest of all palaces. His grandfather is the king of France. His dad is the Dauphin, which is the heir to the throne. Oh, by the way, I'm going to just butcher the French words. I'll try, but my mouth does not do French, so bear with me. And his mother is the daughter of the king of Poland. Louis was the 4th of 8 children, I think. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what the confusion is. It seems like this would be very well documented and easy to find out. But every single source I found had different information about Louis XVI's siblings. Some say he had 3 older siblings who all died as babies, making him the oldest surviving child, with 2 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters. Other sources claimed that his older brother, also named Louis, did not in fact die as a baby, but lived until he was 9 years old. And then a handful of other sources just listed Louis XVI's children as his siblings. So I don't know. The internet is very confused on this, but it kind of matters because what I want to know is, was Louis XVI raised as the next king of France or not? Was it always going to be him, or did he really have a surviving older brother in line for the throne? Biography.com says, quote, Louis's parents paid little attention to him, instead focusing on his older brother, the heir apparent, Louis Duc de Bourgogne, who died at age 9, end quote. So they're in the he died at age 9 camp. But then multiple other sources say that this older Louis died as a baby, so I don't know. But it matters to me. It matters if Louis XVI was raised as the next king or not, because if he was, they didn't do a very good job. So maybe he wasn't, and that would explain a lot. It reminds me of Henry VIII, who also wasn't supposed to be king. He was the second son, and so he was basically left to his own devices, hunting and gallivanting around until his older brother Arthur died, and everyone was like, oh crap, we forgot to train the spare. So Louis XVI is the oldest son now, at least at some point, and he's often described as very healthy, like hardy stock, good physical health. But part of me wonders if he was maybe just average, but all 3 of the first children were sickly and weak, so to his parents, he's this miraculously strong, healthy child. I don't know. Biography.com says, quote, Louis XVI grew up strong and healthy, though very shy. He was tutored by French noblemen and studied religion, morality, and humanities. He excelled in Latin, history, geography, and astronomy, and achieved fluency in Italian and English. With his good health, Louis enjoyed physical activities, including hunting and wrestling. From an early age, he enjoyed locksmithing, which became a lifelong hobby, end quote. A regular Henry VIII. Except much less charismatic. He was quite introverted, shy, not very outspoken. Stay tuned. I'll be right back after a quick break.
Do you love great business stories, but you just don't have the time to explore all of them? In our podcast called Great Business Stories, my co-host Keith and me, Cayman, we go deep into the most compelling business stories ever told. Episodes include PayPal, the greatest startup story of all time. Ray Kroc, was he a hero or a villain? And Ackman versus Icahn, the Herbalife battle that shook Wall Street. So if you want to hear great stories with intriguing characters, in-depth storytelling and high-stakes dramas, then tune in to Great Business Stories.
When Louis was 11, his father died of tuberculosis, and he became the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. His mother died 2 years later, also of tuberculosis, as one does in a pre-antibiotics world. And biography.com says, quote, Louis was ill-prepared for the throne he was soon to inherit. Following the death of his parents, Louis's tutors provided him with poor interpersonal skills. They exacerbated his shyness by teaching him that austerity was a sign of strong character in monarchs. As a result, he presented himself as being very indecisive, end quote. Austerity meaning like sternness, severity, not lighthearted or charismatic. He was not a schmoozer, and he was also not a go-getter. He was sort of weak and slightly socially weird. Probably not his fault. Over half his family died by the time he was 11. I think we can retroactively factor that trauma in. But when he was 15 years old, he married the then 14-year-old Marie Antoinette. She was the 15th child, yes, 15th, of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa, who was part of the very powerful Habsburg family. Marie Antoinette was from Austria, which was at that time part of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a confusing name, and in the words of Voltaire, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was basically a collection of city-states in Central Europe, mostly what's today Germany, Austria, and Italy, that often fought each other and eventually dissolved. But the Habsburgs were a very powerful family that ruled Europe for hundreds of years, really. Super inbred, but super powerful. And Marie Antoinette was a Habsburg. She was also Louis's second cousin once removed. So this was an arranged marriage, a political marriage. Louis and Marie never even met each other before they were married. And the marriage, while a strategic union of two powerful ruling families, much like Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, it was a bit controversial, for the French at least. A previous union with the Habsburgs had gotten France wrapped up in the 7 Years' War, or what we call in America the French and Indian War, which Winston Churchill would later famously refer to as the real World War I. So the French were wary of Marie's Habsburg ties. They weren't sure if they were really feeling the Habsburgs at this point. Now, luckily, Marie Antoinette is everything Louis wasn't socially. She's very charming, very charismatic, very Anne Boleyn, really. She's electric. She walks into a room and heads turn. And it's not even just her looks, although she was stunning with ash blonde hair, large, pale, gray-blue eyes, and a radiant complexion. But it's not just that. It's just her energy. She has the it factor. But much like Anne Boleyn, we all know how that ended. Marie quickly becomes someone everyone loves to hate. There's something about an intelligent, independent, outspoken, beautiful, powerful woman that everyone seems to like the idea of, but hate in practice. That's just a patriarchy thing, I'm pretty sure. She challenged the natural order. And so the French eventually came to absolutely despise Marie Antoinette. And some of that was her own fault, no doubt, and some of that was the patriarchy dealing with a challenge to the natural order. And she was kind of silly, honestly. Her tutor described her as smart, but lazy, frivolous, and hard to teach. After marrying Louis when she was 14, she had very few official duties, and so she mostly just socialized extravagantly. According to a History.com article about her, quote, she had a model farm built on the palace grounds so that she and her ladies-in-waiting could dress in elaborate costumes and pretend to be milkmaids and shepherdesses, end quote. So, weird, But also, she's a child. Can we really blame her for playing make-believe with her friends? She's a child. But she's also now married to the heir to the French throne and soon to become Queen of France. When Louis's grandfather, Louis XV, dies in 1774, Louis becomes Louis XVI, King of France, at the age of 20. Biography.com says he was, quote, immature and lacked self-confidence. Plus, he's been married for 4 years now, and there are no children yet, no heirs, and people have noticed, and they care very much about this. And actually, Louis and Marie will not have any children until 8 years after their marriage. And people take great offense to this for some reason. This is a problem. And it's, of course, all Marie's fault. Biography.com says, quote, the first few years of marriage for Louis and Marie were amicable but distant. His shyness kept him distant from her in private, and his fear of her manipulation made him cold to her in public. It is believed the couple did not consummate their marriage for some time, having their first child 8 years after their wedding. Historians debate the cause, but most likely Louis suffered from a physiological dysfunction that took time to rectify. End quote. But France blamed Marie, claiming that she was unfaithful and adulterous. History.com says, quote, widely circulated newspapers and inexpensive pamphlets poked fun at the Queen's profligate behavior and spread outlandish, even pornographic rumors about her. Before long, it had become fashionable to blame Marie Antoinette for all of France's problems. End quote. And while, yes, she did possibly have at least one affair that we know of with a Swedish diplomat named Axel von Fersen, which, really? Is that really his name? That was, straight out of a romance novel. But really, she was not the floozy they made her out to be. Her husband was just shy and weird and super intimidated by her and possibly had something physical going on down there. And also, they were children. So there's that. Marie was probably like, oh, thank God, I'm going to go play with my friends now. I'll get more into the Axel von Fersen allegations and other Marie Antoinette scandals and such in that mini-fix I promised. Look for that over on the Patreon on Wednesday, little midweek treat for you. Anyway, despite France being all up in their personal business, Louis and Marie eventually do at some point consummate their marriage and have 4 children together, only one of whom will survive to adulthood, sadly. So Louis XVI, just based on his personality and demeanor alone, is not a great king. He's not inherently a great king. Henry kind of was, at least in his early years. You have to hand it to him. He was decisive and charismatic and confident, and he owned it. Louis is not owning it. He's weak and indecisive, and he gives in to whoever wants to push their own agenda on him. He's spineless. Now looking back through a modern lens, according to biography.com, quote, modern historians attribute this behavior to a clinical depression that left him prone to paralyzing indecisiveness, end quote. And it doesn't help that things already aren't great in France when he takes the throne. The system is failing, and it's not really Louis's fault. He didn't come up with the system. So what is the system? Well, France at the time is a feudal system, which is like a super strict social hierarchy, and it's all based on land ownership. In France, there are 3 social classes, which are called estates. The first estate is the clergy, Catholic church guys, priests, and such, because the church owns most of the land. The Catholic Church has all this land in France, and so people who are part of the church, that puts them in the top tier of the social hierarchy, because it's all based on land ownership. The second estate is the nobility. They own the second most land. And the third estate is everyone else, from the middle class down to the peasants. Most of France is in the third estate, but it's the first and second estates that have all the power because they own the most land. Now, this system had worked in the past, but by the time Louis took the throne in the 1770s, it wasn't working anymore. Same reason the American Revolution broke out. People were sick of it. They were sick of being controlled by the 1%. And they were sick of it because the scales had finally tipped for a few reasons. Between 1715 and 1800, the population of Europe doubled. This was mostly due to higher standards of living, better hygiene, new innovations, the Enlightenment, right? People are thinking again, and mortality is dropping. The population doubled during the 1700s, and by 1789, France was the most populated country in Europe. So more people obviously puts more strain on a country, more competition for resources and whatnot. But with that Enlightenment also came this emerging group of wealthy commoners. They aren't clergy, they aren't nobility, they're just regular guys, but they also aren't poor anymore. This is kind of new. They're professionals. Many of them are merchants who have profited immensely from all of the colonialism and slave labor, really, if we're honest, in the Americas. They are self-made men, and they don't really fit in to the old social hierarchy of clergy, nobles, and peasants. This is the bourgeoisie, the middle class emerging, and they want a taste of the power. But even the peasants are wising up. They aren't just living in squalor and dying now like they used to do. Higher standards of living mean they are surviving. They're getting an education, they're owning land, and they're thinking, too. They're thinking, hey, feudalism is kind of the worst. They didn't really have time to think like that before. They were just surviving. But now the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the peasants, these third estate guys, they're starting to question the way things have always been done. And this third estate, just so you know, comprises 98% of France's population. And yet, they can still be overruled by the first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility, because everything is based on land ownership, not majority, not population. So the system's starting to fail. But to make matters worse, the economy starts to tank too. New gold mines discovered in Brazil in the 1730s had led to an economic boom. But by about the 1770s, that boom started to bust, as booms are wont to do. And what else happens in the 1770s? The American Revolution. And who comes to our aid against their own archenemy, Great Britain? France. Thank you, Louis. Appreciate it. Really got us out of a jam there. But France does not have the money for this war. Their Brazil gold mine boom is busting and their population has exploded. And so Louis goes into debt, serious debt, to fund France's involvement in the American Revolution, like brink of bankruptcy debt. Oh, and then cherry on top, serious crop failures in 1788. So booming population, busting economy, plus crop failures, and Louis is just a spineless jellyfish up there, just not really doing much, not taking charge. Maria's off pretending to be a milkmaid or whatever. France is in trouble. So the Controller General of Finances, Monsieur de Calonne, hatches a plan in 1787. He's like, hey, I'm all enlightened. I'm with the program. I read Voltaire. I read Rousseau. I'm with all these new philosophies, and I know what to do. And he proposes a universal land tax from which the nobility will no longer be exempt, because they were exempt before. They didn't have to pay the land taxes that commoners were paying, even though they own most of the land. Make that make sense. He wants to tax the upper classes, finally, which duh. But the upper classes also still have all the power. So, how do you get them to agree to tax their own selves? He calls a group of noblemen together and a few bourgeoisie, but mostly noblemen. And he's like, what do you guys think about paying those land taxes you didn't have to pay before to get us out of all this debt? And predictably, they're like, I mean, we'd rather not. So they do something they haven't done since 1614. They call on the Estates General. This was like a convening of delegates, representatives from all three of the estates, all three of the social classes, the clergy, the noblemen, and the commoners. They elected these guys from the different regions to represent each estate. 300 from the first estate, the clergy, 300 from the second estate, the nobility, and 600 from the third estate, the commoners. But by the time they actually met in May of 1789, things had gotten worse. There were those 1788 crop failures between then and now, which had caused the price of food, most notably bread, to skyrocket. And at the time, in 1788, Louis thought it was a good idea to grant freedom of the press. Actually, someone was probably just like, hey, you should grant freedom of the press. And he was like, Roger that. But I mean, it does seem like a good thing, right? We're all for freedom of the press in the US, but it will turn nasty there, as it has here recently. And it will contribute to the division and paranoia that leads to a very bloody revolution. Fake news is nothing new. So the Estates General finally meets in May of 1789, but they immediately run into a problem. Should they go with a popular vote, like a vote for each guy, regardless of class, or should they vote by estate, where those who own more land have more say, meaning that the first and second estates could outvote the third estate despite being the major minority? This is how it was done the last time the Estates General met back in 1614, so like 175 years ago. So, of course, the two higher classes, the first and second estates, they're like, well, this is how it's always been done. We get more votes than you, and we vote no land taxes for the rich, and we always win. So, And the third estate is like, well, that's not fair because we're not stupid anymore, and we deserve an equal vote, and we vote land taxes for the rich because y'all can afford it anyway. And so they're sort of at a standstill over this. By June 17th, the third estate has had it with these pompous jerks. They separate from the first and second estates, and they declare themselves the National Assembly, and they're just going to make the decision on their own. When royal officials lock them out of the meeting house, they go meet at the king's indoor tennis courts, where they swore an oath called the Tennis Court Oath to stay until they had drafted a new constitution for France. Louis's like, actually, we kind of just wanted you to weigh in on the universal land tax thing. And they're like, no, we got this, dude. We're going to rework the whole government. It's fine. But Louis's not loving this for obvious reasons. So he goes to the other two estates and he's like, go get in there. Go to the tennis courts or whatever and balance those guys out. Why do you think I brought you here? Get in there. I mean, if you want, I guess. And some of them go join the National Assembly Tennis Court Peasants by July, and they change the name to National Constituent Assembly. But even though Louis urged them to do that, he's still not loving this assembly, and he starts gathering troops to dissolve it. I'm telling you, he is nothing if not wishy-washy. Now, meanwhile, so de Calonne, the finance guy, proposed the universal land tax like 2 years ago. This committee finally came together in May of 1789 to weigh in on it. Now it's July, so 2 months have passed, and they have accomplished absolutely nothing. The people are getting more and more restless. It feels like they're stalling. It feels like they're avoiding dealing with this problem. And the problem is worse than ever. By the summer of 1789, the food problem has reached its peak. The price of a loaf of bread had skyrocketed to almost an entire day's wages for most people. Can you imagine working an 8-hour shift or more and only barely being able to afford a loaf of bread with what you earned? That is not sustainable. But also the media is in a frenzy. Louis opened the newspaper and pamphlet floodgates when he granted freedom of the press. And they're stirring up some mess, throwing out rumors of an aristocratic conspiracy. The sensationalized media has everyone believing that the king and the upper classes are intentionally trying to overthrow the Third Estate. And this led to the Great Fear of July 1789. The peasants are panicking, they're starving, and no one is doing anything about it. Not only are they not doing anything, they've now been led to believe by the media that the king is actively working against them. And, troops are gathering around the capital. Louis is gathering troops, hoping to disband this out-of-control tennis court assembly that isn't going his way, whatever his way even is, because he doesn't even seem to know. Panic and paranoia take over, and this leads to an insurrection led by the commoners, the peasants. The people storm the Bastille, which was a medieval fortress that was currently being used as a prison. But it was really just a symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy. The despotism of the monarchy, tyranny, that's what the Bastille represented. They storm it, they bust in, hoping to arm themselves with the gunpowder and weapons that are stored there. And this event, the storming of the Bastille, has since come to be viewed as the start of the French Revolution. They also burned and looted the homes of tax collectors, landlords, and aristocrats during this Great Fear summer of 1789. These actions would prompt the National Constituent Assembly to finally take action, abolishing the feudal system on August 4th and introducing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen on August 26th, which proclaimed liberty, equality, the inviolability of property, which is like security, it's safe, right? Property can't be violated, and also the right to resist oppression. But of course, Louis was like, heck no. What are we, even if we can't violate property and oppress people? Or his guys whispered that in his ear, at least. So he refuses to sanction these decrees, which in the past might have worked. This was an absolute monarchy. If the king refuses to sanction your decrees, that's it, no decrees. Well, that's not how things work now, not since the peasants stormed the Bastille. In their minds, that was the end of the old order, the ancien régime. So they aren't taking no for an answer. Parisians marched to Versailles on October 5th. Actually, Parisian women, this was like a woman mob, which is really cool. And they marched to the Palace of Versailles on October 5th. Versailles is like 9 miles outside of Paris. So they marched to Versailles, which is where the royal family is, and they forced them back to Paris. They're like, we're doing this. Get your butt back to Paris and make it happen. My kids are not starving anymore. Leave it to a mama. And the National Constituent Assembly carries on drafting this new constitution for the new France. Now, at the time, the rest of Europe is too busy for this mess. They aren't paying much mind to what's happening in France. They don't really care. France can do whatever it wants as long as it leaves them alone. In America, a fledgling country fresh out of its own revolution, people are initially into it. They're like, yeah, France, rise up and stick it to the man like we did. But that excitement, that stokedness, shifts pretty quickly. Because not long after the storming of the Bastille by the common man and the abolishing of the feudal system by the tennis court guys and marching the king back to Paris by the angry mamas to get everything straight, things take a turn and get real radical and real violent and real scary. And America is like, yeah, France, let's go. Oh, nope, never mind, nope. And before long, the rest of Europe is forced to acknowledge what's happening in France too, because it turns out the new France has no intentions of leaving them alone. What goes boom soon must bust. And as the fervor, the patriotism, the jubilation of the Bastille insurrection and the common man rising up and overthrowing the tyrannical overlords, as that fades, what's left standing when the dust clears is something rather horrifying indeed. What happens when a revolution leads to something even worse than you had before? Join me next week to find out. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting, and maybe you even learned something new. Be sure to follow my Instagram at HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from biography.com, history.com, Encyclopedia Britannica, the U.S. Office of the Historian, and Chateau de Versailles. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.